We are involved in our consideration of making a biblical appeal. I listed a number of people in the Bible for whom there is a record of appeals that they made, both men and women. However, we have focused our attention to the women because of the obvious social and cultural mismatch that took place in the lives of such women as Ruth and Abigail and Esther and Bathsheba, as they made appeals to men who occupied unassailable positions in their lives, where they could make no demands on these guys, absolutely none. They dare not furrow their brow in front of these guys if they want life to continue on as it was, because of the social disparity that existed in those cultures. Then we looked at the examples of wives that could have made appeals, who should have made appeals, but did not. Last week we looked at Lot's wife, mentioned only at the very end of her life, when she and her husband Lot and two of, we have good reason to believe that they had at least 4 daughters, 2 of them married. Lot appealed to those 2 daughters and their husbands, and they laughed at them. He said, you know, God's judgment is impending. We got to get out of town right now. And they laughed at him. So the angels took by force Lot, his wife, and the 2 virgin daughters that he offered to that group of men in an attempt to be a good host. He basically dishonored the virtue of his daughters. And when they were told, as they were being taken out of Sodom, don't look back. She looked back, and the Bible says she was turned to a pillar of salt. So now what we're going to look at this evening is the situation with Abigail. Is it possible for someone to be in one breath a heroine and then in another breath very disappointing? Yeah, because we're human beings, okay? It's possible to be the most highly decorated combat veteran in U.S. military history named Audie Murphy, and to be a quivering, bawling crybaby almost every night after he got home from the war. You say, well, how could that? They're the same guy, okay? One guy in combat is a terror, but when he gets home and he's in the comfort of his own home, in his own bedroom, in his own bed, and he goes to sleep, he feels terrorized, and it's the same guy. And so we can have people who are both cowardly and heroic. We can have people who are honorable and dishonorable. I remember one time the actor David Niven was on television being interviewed, and he talked about this despicable character who was treated so well by an agent, and was lauded and praised and cultivated and taken at a young age and developed in his career over time. And then when at precisely the moment when he could have in turn done the most beneficial possible favor to this agent, he was betrayed. And Johnny Carson then asked him, and who was this despicable guy? He said, it was me. The nasty guy was David Niven. David Niven, who had left Hollywood to go back to England at the outbreak of World War II, was a highly decorated combat veteran in the British Army, and yet he possessed physical courage, which is really not that rare. Physical courage is really not that rare. What is really rare is moral courage, okay? I know guys that have joined the military and done tour after tour after tour after tour and are decorated combat veterans, but if you get them in a social situation and ask them to make a comment, to stand up for what's right, they, I don't want to
talk about it.
Because they're moral cowards. You can be the bravest of men in the threat of physical danger and be the most cowardly man when it comes to being prepared to deal with the furrowed brow of your friends or family. So it's difficult for us perhaps to get our mind around this woman named Abigail, but let's consider her situation. I'm not a woman. I've never identified as a woman. I think one Halloween when I was a kid, I dressed up as a very convincing female, but that's long before I came to the knowledge of Christ, back when I was a boy. So I don't really know what goes on in the mind of women all the time, but there are certain things the Bible tells you. And one of the obvious things, it's very difficult for a woman to be married to a fool. And sometimes you can have a noble woman, an intelligent woman, a thoughtful woman, a godly woman, a virtuous woman, and the guy she's married to is a complete fool. He's just a fool. And I wish if I could get girls when they're 13, 14, 15, 16 years of age and shake some sense into them, it would be that they understand this rule: a great date doesn't necessarily make a great mate. Think about that. Just because a guy is fun to be with does not at all mean he is husband material. Because husband material is the responsible provider, protector type. And the guy who's great on a date may have none of those qualities. Absolutely none of those qualities. And but he's so slick. Yeah, the reason he's so slick is because he's had so much practice on so many different women. So a girl needs to ask herself if she wants to get married to somebody who has as much mileage on him as a Mack truck. Guys should ask the same question. It's very difficult for a woman to be married to a fool, but most women, as they're contemplating marriage, they never even ask themselves whether the guy they like is a fool or a wise man. And if it's lust instead of love, you can tell lust instead of love. Lust keeps the person away from everyone you know. Because you know that the people you know will not like him, will not trust him, and are not impressed by him. So you keep the nitwit away from everybody that you know and love, okay? Whereas if you've latched onto somebody that wow, this person is great, and you really know they're great, and you really love the person, you want to, if it's a guy, you want to take her to introduce her to all your family and all your friends, and you want everybody to know her. But if she's just a slut, then you keep her as far away from your friends and family as you possibly can. By the same token, if you're a female and the guy that you are in hopes of spending the rest of your life with is what you think is a real deal, you want your family to know him, you want your friends to know him, and by the way, this person you bring to church, okay? There's two reasons why someone brings someone to church. There's the right reason to bring them to church and the wrong reason to bring them to church. And if they won't go to church at all, well, okay. But if you bring the person to church, there's two possible reasons why you're doing this. Either you want the church to check this person out. By the way, that's the right reason. Or you want this person to check the church out. That's the wrong reason. And we've had both take place and transpire over the 1.5 years that I've been here. But let's get back to Abigail. She was married to a fool. Now, by fool, I do not refer to a stupid man. I refer to a man who is careless with his soul. I refer to a man who is careless with his family's souls. I refer to a man who repeatedly refuses, because he has no fear of God. He has no fear of God. He refuses to consider the long-term consequences of the decisions that he makes about important matters and their spiritual implications. Sadly, many women these days find themselves married to foolish men, and they got nobody to blame because they said yes, okay? It may very well be that the rise of modern feminism, so destructive to the long-term welfare of women for the resulting loss of the skills that are so useful in dealing with men and are commended so frequently in the Bible, it could be that this rise of modern feminism is partly a consequence of the frustration so many women have faced when dealing with foolish men, that they've just given up on them. That the average guy that they encounter is such a nitwit. He's such a joker. He's such a tool. Is that an okay word? Or is that a really nasty word? Back when I was a teenager, a tool was kind of like a jerk, okay? Sometimes words change meaning. I hope I didn't say, I hope I didn't utter a vulgarism. That women have gotten to the place where, what's the point when dealing with these guys? Because they're unaccomplished clowns. They don't learn anything. So few of them have marketable skills. So many of them are financially irresponsible, socially irresponsible, and they are guys without integrity. Their word counts for nothing. They can be depended upon for nothing, and they're sneaky little vermin like cowards. They're just sneaks. They're like small rodents. Okay, they're not quite cockroaches, but they're like small rodents. Okay, they sneak around and they live in the cracks and the crevices. Okay. And as a result of that, women have just like, what's the point? Okay? And they've resorted to, you can't honor somebody like that. You can't respect someone who doesn't deserve it at all. And so they've given up on guys, okay? And they've embraced feminism, which is worse, actually. It's sad, and there are lots of potential as we read through the Bible, this Old Testament portion of Scripture. We see that there was potential for Abigail to have made appeals in this encounter that I want to set before you. We know that she made this masterful, basically it's the best appeal I think that can be found anywhere in the Bible, made by a woman, and it might be a tie with the appeal that Daniel made to the prince of the eunuchs in Daniel chapter 1, as far as being masterful. Abigail's is a masterful appeal, but she doesn't make any appeal of this nature to fool, her husband Nabal. Think about what foolish Nabal might have been like if his wife had trusted God and appealed to him, to her husband, regardless of his past folly. You say, well, the reason she didn't appeal to him is because she had tried a dozen times more and it never worked out. At what point do you abandon God's plan? That's the question. At what point do you give up on God's plan? God doesn't have a plan B. God doesn't have a plan B for the gospel. He doesn't have a plan B for a person's life. So you don't give up and then decide to go your own way because you have not met with what you believe is success up to this point. We don't know. So imagine, if you would, consider what it would have been like for Nabal had his wife appealed to him and perhaps appealed to him again and appealed to him again. So at the time of our encounter, which is in 1 Samuel chapter 25, we should understand that David is already, and many of you already know this, but I'm rehearsing for those of you that might not. By the time we come to the treatment of Abigail in the Bible, David is already a hero in Israel. Some years earlier, as a teenage boy, he slew the giant Goliath, took him down with his sling and a stone, and then cut his head off. Okay? He has, in the interim, been taken into King Saul's household when he married Saul's daughter Michal. And he has been victorious in battle against the Philistines, with the women of his people singing his praises. And the praises they sang about David was, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Of course, this praise that was directed to David provoked King Saul's jealousy, and that eventually forced David to flee for his life because Saul himself tried to kill him, and then he set his men on David to chase him down and try to run him to ground and take his life. On the run with his band of men, notice the appeal of David's men on behalf of David to this man named Nabal that we see in 1 Samuel chapter 25, beginning with verse 1. And Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Okay, that's in the Negev, that's south of Beersheba. And there was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel. Now, this is not the Carmel, Mount Carmel up in the north. This is down in the south, a second community. Like, there were 2 Bethlehems in Israel, so there are 2 Carmels in Israel. This is the southern one. And the man was very great, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. In other words, she was a smart, attractive woman. But the man, that is her husband, Nabal, was churlish and evil in his doings, and he was of the house of Caleb. What does that tell us? He was of the house of Caleb. What does that tell us? You're reading through the Bible, and you see he's of the house of Caleb. You stop, you pause, you take note of the fact, oh, if he's of the house of Caleb, there are several things I know about him. What? I know he's of the tribe of Judah. Remember, Caleb was the head of the tribe of Judah, who, when he and Joshua went in to spy out the land, they were the only 2 that came out and had a good report. Joshua, the leader of the Ephraim tribe, and Caleb, the leader of the Judah tribe. So if this guy is a descendant of Caleb, that means he's of the tribe of Judah. Well, isn't that interesting? That's the same tribe David is in. Okay. Verse 4, and David heard in the wilderness that Nabal did shear his sheep. And David sent out 10 young men, and David said unto the young men, get you up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Why did he send 10 guys? What's the point? You say, well, couldn't one guy do it? Yeah, but you don't want to go alone. Okay, 2 guys, maybe 3. Why 10? Why 10? Now, let's be practical, folks. When you're reading the Bible, you got to have your thinking cap on. You got to be of a practical mindset. Why 10? Well, because a small squad of men has to have a light machine gun, right? No. They didn't have machine guns back in those days. Why 10? What do you think David was trying to do by sending 10 men? Genesis He was trying to make a big impression. Okay? So it was important to David what Nabal thought about him. Okay? As evidenced by the fact this is a guy he's trying to impress. All right? And thus shall you say to him that liveth in prosperity. In other words, this is what I want you to tell that rich guy. Peace be both to thee, and peace be to thine house, and peace be unto all that thou hast. So I want peace to you and your family and all of your stuff. And now I have heard that thou hast shearers, and how thy shepherds which were with us, and we hurt them not, neither was there aught missing unto them all the while they were in Carmel. In other words, hey, your guys and my guys hung together, and when your guys and my guys hung together, my guys didn't take any of your stuff. Verse 8, ask thy young men, and they will show thee. Hey, your own guys can verify this. Wherefore, let the young men find favor in thine eyes, for we come in a good day. Give, I pray thee, whatsoever cometh into thine hand unto thy servants and to thy son David. Thy son David. I'm acknowledging you're older, I'm younger, you're rich, I'm not. I'm sending 10 guys to have a favorable impression upon you. What are some of the things that David wants to impress upon Nabal? I can think of a couple of ways he wants to impress the guy. Number one, he thinks that Nabal is important enough to send 10 guys. Number two, he wants to impress Nabal that he has some wicked warfighters. He has some experienced combat veterans. And he wants Nabal to be aware of that. My guys know how to fight. He's not trying to threaten the guy. He's trying to impress the guy. Right? Verse 9, and when David's young men came, they spake to Nabal according to all the words in the name of David, and ceased. In other words, they delivered their pitch, and then they stopped. Well, this is what you do when you're making an appeal. You come to the place where you just shut up. By the way, any of you ever been involved in sales? Anybody here ever, even if you were a failure at sales? Okay. When you're selling and you make your pitch, then what do, Daniel? You stop talking. You shut up. Because the next person who talks loses. If you make a pitch and you're the next person who talks, you're not going to make the sale. You are not going to make the sale. If you make a pitch and you fill the room with dead air and that other person talks, you got him. You got him. It's like fly fishing. You got him. And so these guys know enough about the art of negotiation, the pitching of an appeal, that they just stopped. Now, what do we see about this somewhat indirect appeal from the young warriors to David's fellow member of the tribe of Judah, who is very, very wealthy and whose wealth David has protected from marauders, from bandits, from thieves? David wants Nabal to honor him for not doing wrong, for not stealing from him, and for protecting his flocks and his herdsmen. Reasonable. This should be seen as a legitimate request in light of David's willingness to protect Nabal's flocks from marauders. And he's not sending these guys in with his chest puffed out, acting all arrogant. He describes himself through these men as your son. In other words, David is demonstrating somewhat humility here. Nabal's response, verse 10, and Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David? Really? Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There be many servants nowadays that break away every man from his master. So he's accusing David of being a runaway slave. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my flesh that I have killed for my shears and give it unto men whom I know not whence they be? I don't know anything about these guys. So David's young men turned their way and went again and came and told him all those things. Now let me ask you this. What do you think was running through the minds of the 10 guys David sent who were rebuffed in this way and turned and went back to David? What do you think was running through their mind? Brian? I don't think so. Who does this stupid old man think he is? I feel like taking his head off right here and right now. But I'm not going to do that because I'd get in worse trouble from David. Oh, I think those 10 guys were ready to kill him on the spot. Understand, these 10 guys are man killers. They are warriors. They are fighters. They have slain Philistines. And this guy has just basically spit in their face in front of each other. I think, in my own imagination, I'm thinking these guys were trembling with rage as they turned, kept their mouths shut, and went back to David. Because Nabal had insulted them. So David's young men, verse 12, turned their way and went again and came and told him all those sayings. And David said unto his men, Gird ye on every man his sword. If we were in the Marine Corps today, this would be a gunnery sergeant saying, okay, everybody, mount up, locked and cocked, let's go. And they girded on every man his sword, and David also girded on his sword, and there went up after David about 400 men, and 200 abode by the stuff. He left 200 behind to watch their stuff. He took 400 fighters with him. He was getting ready to wipe this guy out. He was getting ready to take him out. Okay? Why? Because he had been publicly shamed and dishonored in an honor-shame culture. Okay? Astonishing to think that so wealthy a man as Nabal would engage in such an insulting breach of etiquette to so dangerous a man as David. How could you not know how dangerous David is? And to David's young men, thereby, by insulting these 10 guys, he makes it impossible for David to ignore the insult while preserving his honor in front of his young fighters. You know, guys in the Marine Corps, Marines admire General Mattis. They worship the guy. They worship the guy who is now Secretary of Defense. Rightly so. I mean, this is a guy, I remember one time, and you're smiling because you remember. He walked into a room one time and somebody asked him, says, what do you think about when you walk into a room like this? Well, I generally think about what it would take for me to kill everybody in here. And he talks like that to his soldiers, to his Marines. He doesn't talk like that to diplomats, okay? But he knows how to switch gears depending on where he is. But in order for Mattis to have acquired that reputation over the course of 40 years, he has had to earn and maintain the respect and awe of his troops, which means that if anybody messed with him, he had to make sure, for the sake of the lance corporals that saw it, for the case of the sergeants who saw it, for the case of the second lieutenants and first lieutenants that are looking on, I cannot allow this man to get away with that. I have to deal with him and deal with him harshly, or else I lose the respect of all of my troops, and they will be less likely to comply with my wishes and to take my commands. Same kind of dynamic is working with David here. He's got a dilemma here. Nabal created a terrible dilemma for David to deal with. As well, the fact that he knows David's father is Jesse, that shows us that Nabal knew perfectly well who David was. How could you not know who David was when all of the young women in the country are singing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s? Compounding the insult, of course, is that since Nabal was of the house of Caleb, meaning that he was of the tribe of Judah, just like David, they were in fact distant relatives, were they not? In a culture where family and tribe means almost everything. Go to Iraq and try to deal with those people, taking no account for family and no account for tribe. You're not going to get anywhere. The reason David Petraeus was so successful in Iraq, where guys that went before him as commanders, theater commanders, met with such abysmal failure, is David Petraeus actually read the book that was written by Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia said, when you are dealing with Arabs, forget nationalities. It means nothing to them. If you are dealing with Arabs, you concern yourself with families, clans, and tribes. And by the way, the same thing is true of Afghanistan. Families, clans, and tribes. Native Americans, families, clans, and tribes. Okay? So, this guy knew as much about David as he needed to know to make an informed decision. He's related to me. We're of the same tribe. How close a relative they were, we don't know. He knew exactly who he was and what his accomplishments had been over time. He knew that he was an extremely dangerous man to mess with. Goliath insulted him and his God, and he lost his head over the situation. Saul was looking for him, couldn't find him. And as David wandered about the wilderness, he's gathering fighters to him. He starts out, he's by himself. And he gathered people over time. You read about it in the Old Testament. By the time we're here, he has 600 fighters. And Nabal thinks he can get away with insulting him? So that's the first appeal. A second appeal is found in 1 Samuel chapter 25, beginning with verse 14, where we read that one of Nabal's own, this is Abigail's husband, one of Nabal's men appeals to Nabal's wife, Abigail. This guy appeals to his boss's wife, beginning with verse 14. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he railed on them. But the men were very good to us. In other words, these guys, David's guys, have always been really good to us. And we were not hurt, neither missed we anything, as long as we were conversant with them when we were in the fields. So this guy is corroborating the story of David's guys. They were a wall unto us both by night and day, all the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. So these guys protected them, and they appreciated it. Now, therefore, know and consider what thou wilt do. He said, Now, Abigail, what are you going to do? For evil is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a son of Belial that a man cannot speak to him. So this guy tells Nabal's wife, you got to help us out. The boss is such an idiot. You can't talk to him. Let me just make a comment here. This young man should never have appealed to his mistress Abigail instead of her husband. He should have never said what he just said. Because Nabal is the head of the household. Nabal was the man he worked for. He betrayed the man he worked for as soon as he began speaking to that man's wife. Notice that Abigail showed great disrespect for her husband as well by allowing that young man to approach her with his plea, much less allowing him to get away with talking about her husband in that way. Yeah, and your husband's an idiot. And she's like, you think Nabal didn't know that that's the way his wife reacted behind his back? You think she didn't know that? That said, we learn in this passage that the interaction of David's men with Nabal's men was no secret. Nabal had built up a reputation among his servants as a man who could not be approached. You just couldn't talk to the guy. How many times, think about this, how many times do difficult situations become far worse by refusing to follow the biblical chain of command? What right did this woman, Abigail, and remember, I bragged on her a couple of weeks ago without reservation, but what right did she have to listen to a servant say such things to her about her husband? Say, well, they were true. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they were true. Her God-given job description is to help Nabal. She doesn't help Nabal by listening to guys like this saying things like that. Never mind what the man said about her husband being true. That's beside the point. Nabal is still her husband. Such disloyalty is wrong, no matter what kind of husband she had. He's the only husband she had. She better be loyal to him. As astute as she would later show herself to be when appealing to David and successfully saving the lives of so many, what we see at this point with Abigail is simply not impressive. She had a chance and she blew it. She blew it. So here's Abigail. A terrible situation has been created by her foolish husband, no doubt. What does she do with the problem presented her? Does she employ a biblical appeal? Oh, she appeals all right, but she appeals to the wrong person. In effect, she improperly responds to the servant's improper appeal by herself making an improper appeal. She doesn't appeal to the man she should have appealed to, which was her husband. Look at verse 18. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine and 5 sheep ready dressed and 5 measures of parched corn and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on asses. Wow, she's going all out for this guy who is not her husband. And she said unto her servants, Go on before me, behold, I come after you. But she told not her husband Nabal. Why did she not tell her husband? Because she's dishonoring him. And she knows he would disapprove. She's disrespecting her husband. She's going behind his back. You say, well, he's a fool. You can't talk to him. So, because he's a nitwit, you go behind his back? Verse 20, and it was so, as she rode on the ass, that she came down by the covert of the hill, and behold, David and his men came down against her, and she met them. Now David had said, Surely in vain have I kept all that this fellow hath in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertained unto him, and he hath requited me evil for good. So and more also do God unto the enemies of David. He's going to kill every guy, every male. Verse 23, and when Abigail saw David, she hasted and lighted off the ass, and fell before David on her face, and bowed herself to the ground, and fell at his feet, and said, Upon me, Lord, upon me let this iniquity be. Wow, I wonder if she ever talked like that to her husband. And let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak in thine audience and hear the words of thine handmaid. I wonder if she ever talked like that to her husband. According to 1 Peter chapter 3, Christian women are supposed to emulate Sarah, who called her husband Lord. She's calling David Lord, but not her husband. She's showing great respect for David. We see no evidence of respect being shown to her own husband. Let not my word, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial. She's bad-mouthing him behind his back. Even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thine handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord whom thou didst send. Now therefore, my Lord. And it continues on. Her appeal is great. It's just made to the wrong person. You say, well, it turns out right. Does it? Now, is it any surprise that David delights in her appeal? My goodness, did she talk well to this guy. Wow, what respect she showed. And she wasn't a hard babe to look at besides. How she compliments this man with her perfectly worded appeal. However, she had no right to make the appeal she made without her husband's knowledge. How does she strengthen her husband's position as the leader of his home? By calling him a fool and seeking to protect him like he's a child. Astonishing, is it not, the juxtaposition of error on one hand with wisdom on the other hand, by not appealing to her husband and then so expertly appealing to David. It boggles the mind. But that's the way human beings are. We are nothing if not inconsistent. Amen? I contend that one of the reasons a man like Nabal was a fool, and was the fool he was, is because people typically respond improperly to such foolishness by always covering for such like him in some way and taking the line of least resistance with this kind of stubbornness. How many of you know people that in your own family are nuts? They're just crazy. They're just basket cases. And the reason they get away with it is that everybody in the family continually and repeatedly lets them get away with it. Nobody ever stands up. Nobody ever deals with them properly. Nobody ever deals with them correctly. Nobody ever puts them in their place. And so this tendency just grows and escalates. You see some guy that has a 40-year-old temper tantrum when he doesn't get his way. I can show you a 5-year-old who's in the aisle at Pavilion screaming and crawling and crying and having a fit because he doesn't get candy, and his mom doesn't bust him on the rear end as soon as she gets him to the car. And it grows and develops. Hey, it worked when I was 3. I'll try it again when I'm 4. Hey, it worked when I was 4. I'll try it again when I'm 5. Only you get bigger and you get stronger and you get louder and you get more clever, and by the time the person is 40 years old, you're dealing with a certifiable maniac. I submit to you that this is one explanation of why this guy's the way he is. Instead of resorting to always undercutting his position behind his back while avoiding any confrontation with him, oh, you know how he is, and thereby undermining his authority in his own, she did wrong when she did what she did, the way she did it. No one demanded. Somebody in this guy's life should have demanded that he treat them with respect. You will treat me with respect, sir, or else me and you are going to go around and around. His dad should have made that demand. His mom should have made that demand. His brother should have made that demand. His sister should have made that demand. His wife should have made that demand. It was the perfect storm of a strong-willed fool and those who surrounded him, possibly since childhood, accommodating him rather than dealing with him in a principled fashion. In the end, of course, Nabal died. However, how would he have ended up any worse by having a wife demand that his servants treat him with the respect due her husband? And if she herself had appealed to him instead of appealing to David? You say, well, such men as that don't ever listen, Pastor. Perhaps, but would it have ended up any worse for Nabal than it did? Not for him. He ended up dead in any case. And her own hands would have been cleaner for not having sinned against her husband by being disloyal to him. What would have happened if Abigail had only appealed to Nabal instead of David in the manner in which she appealed to David? Nabal to treat David with respect and courtesy because he was. Appeals should always be made based upon that person's self-interest, right? Hey, husband, you want to stay alive until tomorrow? You want to see the sun come up tomorrow? Then listen to me, would you please? You're not going to get out of this alive unless you listen to me. We're never going to know the consequences that would have been had she done right. Because, tragically, she did not do right. Questions? Comments? Outrageous opinions that disagree with mine? Yes, Genesis. Louder, please.
Would this be the case that she did wrong, but the consequences ended up being right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. David didn't end up killing anybody. So she made the right appeal, but to the wrong guy. So, if anything, maybe this shows us that, does God expect absolute perfection in everything? Because he's not going to get it from us, is he? Sometimes you learn later, ooh, I made a great appeal, but to the wrong person. And so for the rest of her life, she wonders, what would it have been like? What might it have been like had I made the appeal to Nabal that I made to David? Because she's relegated to third or fourth or fifth class wifeness with David. Okay? She's not ever going to be his number one wife. Okay? And she might have been Nabal's number one wife had she appealed to Nabal the way she appealed to David. Okay? Turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, and I'll leave you with this before we hand in our attendance slips. 1 Peter chapter 3. See, I think that Nabal is basically the perfect picture of a bully. He's a bully. He's a rich, powerful man who can throw his weight around, and he bullies people. Okay? How do you deal with a bully? You punch him in the nose. I mean, and if you're a wife, you really can't do that. But how do you deal with a bully? Okay? 1 Peter chapter 3. Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word. So you got a husband who's a bully. He's a nasty man. He's just a nasty, nasty, nasty man. What do you do? What do you do when you deal with a nasty man? You do right. When you don't know what to do, you do right. That if any obey not the word, they also may be won without the word be won by the conversation of the wives, that is, the conduct of the wife. While they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. This is a frequently misunderstood verse. A bully husband should look at his wife and see that she is chaste in her conduct. In other words, this is a godly woman, coupled with fear, but not fear of her husband. The Christian is denied permission to ever be afraid of another human being. Permission denied. Lord, can I be scared of him because he can beat me up? Permission denied. Permission denied. You are not allowed by God to be afraid of a human being. Okay? The Lord Jesus Christ very specifically said, don't fear someone who can only kill you. Rather fear him who is able to cast both body and soul into hellfire. In other words, don't you dare fear any man for any reason. Fear God. I have had occasion over the course of my 40 years in the ministry to observe a bully dealing with a godly wife. And I mean godly. I mean a wife who's not afraid of him. Not afraid of him at all. You say, well, what if he punches her in the face? No, I'm talking about a woman who has been repeatedly punched by her husband. But then she came to the place in her life where she was no longer afraid of him because she feared God. You know how unnerving it is to a bully when you're dealing with somebody smaller than you and they are not afraid of you at all. You can come with your heaviest load and they're not going to be afraid of you. They're not going to be afraid of you. And God will honor that. God will honor that. That guy needs to consider what God might do to him if he messes with one of God's children. And a bully is, after all, at the very core of his being, a what? What is a bully at the core? A coward. A bully is a coward. Guys that are really strong, they don't do that kind of stuff. Guys that are really courageous, they don't do that kind of stuff. Bullies are cowards. They're cowards, which means the fear is already there. You just don't know how to use it against them. The way you use a coward's fear against him is you fear God, because if you fear God, you're not going to have any fear left over for men. But if you fear men, you're not going to have any fear left over to fear God. You either fear God or you fear somebody else. So my recommendation is fear God. I think, although the Bible is absolutely silent on this, I am of the opinion that it is likely that Abigail was afraid of her husband, but not afraid of David. Why would she be afraid of her husband, but not afraid of David? She knew she was smart. She knew she was drop-dead gorgeous. She knew the effect she would have on this man who was living out in the sticks, because she had grown up acquiring an understanding of the impact her appearance had on men. She knew what her appearance, how it affected men. And on top of that, she was smart. She also knew, what I got doesn't work on this guy, the guy that I'm married to, because he's used to me, been around me too much. And he's a fool. So I think that she was afraid of him, but not afraid of David. Sad. She should have feared God. Everything would have turned out better if she had feared God. Anybody have a question? Say, Pastor, you're being hard on this woman. No. I bragged on her big time a couple of weeks ago. But if you're going to be honest, you point out a person's strong points, and then you draw attention to their weak points. Right? That's the way you ought to do it. No questions? Pass your attendance slips to the nearest aisle, if you would, please. Some announcements.